guys, I'm Nirupam from the Underwater Photography Guide and Blue Water Photo. I'm here today with Stephen Miller, Ikelite's in-house camera guru in sunny Southern California. We just had the awesome opportunity to dive on Catalina Island all day in the cold water, but it was clear, lots of beautiful fish, and we used a bunch of different camera systems, all of them new to the market. Stephen here had the opportunity to shoot the new OM system, OM-1, Micro Four Thirds mirrorless camera. It's one of the most exciting cameras on the market currently because it's the new Olympus's newest camera. Now I say the new Olympus because Olympus was sold last year, or maybe it was a year before that, to a company called OM System. And the OM System OM-1 is OM System's first flagship camera. So it's got all the bells and whistles. And I wanted to talk to Stephen about his experience today with the camera. So Stephen, how'd you like it?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I guess I should say first that I haven't used a lot of Olympus cameras other than like the TG series, the point and shoots. So I didn't have a lot of experience. And I guess the first thing I would say about the camera is I found the transition to this really easy. I hadn't even held this camera or seen it until last night. And yet I didn't have any difficulty in the water. To me, it reminds me a lot of every Canon and Nikon DSLR that I've been shooting over the last 10 years or 20 years. So I found the transition to be really, really easy. I mean, when I'm shooting this camera, though, I'm going to kind of dummy it down. What I really want to do is be able to change my aperture, be able to change my shutter speed, possibly ISO, but I didn't need to do that today. And then the lens in particular I like for this lot is a 7 to 14 millimeter, and that is just a great focal range for people that like to shoot wide angle and close focus wide angle, which is definitely my preference for shooting.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I had an opportunity to look at the camera and I felt like the button layout and just the system was set up very much like a Sony or Nikon would be. So I thought that was pretty cool that it just felt a little more intuitive than older Olympus models. And it really seemed like they were thinking out, how they were designing the body.
Yeah.
So I guess when it comes to image quality, did you notice a difference from previous Micro Four Thirds cameras, or did you notice anything in your shots or anything like that?
No, definitely not. Again, this could have been several other cameras for me underwater. Honestly, the button configuration, the way we set this up for the dive was the 4 buttons on the back. Basically, there's a rocker, so going left, right versus up, down will allow me to change my aperture or change my shutter speed. So that was really straightforward. I'll tell you one of the things I really liked about the camera, though, is the electronic viewfinder allows me to preview my images in camera. Now I'm using a magnified viewfinder, a 45-degree viewfinder when I'm shooting this. When I've taken an image, what drives me crazy about DSLRs, really, is that I go to take an image and then I look at the screen, the sun's hitting the screen, my lenses aren't the greatest in my mask, and basically it's very difficult to see it. But the viewfinder, I've calibrated to my eye, and I have a magnified 45-degree viewfinder built into the housing. So what that allows me to do is when I go to preview an image, I put my head down to the viewfinder on the housing, and I can see this image like I'm in a dark room with my laptop. Yeah. And for me, and again, this is true of all electronic viewfinders, I guess, but to me, that's a real game changer because I look at the screen, I can't even see my menus. When the sunlight's hitting this, I see nothing. I look in the viewfinder and I see everything, and it's sharp and it's crisp.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is incredible about EVFs is the fact that you could do a dive without even taking your head off the camera body. And even looking up. So you could do the whole dive looking through the camera. And it depends on your diving style, right? Like some people like to look at things while they're diving, but if that's the case, then you just use the LCD. But if you're one of those types of people that really want the image and really want to be able to view everything, that I do agree. Like I think the magnified viewfinder is one of the best.
Now when we're shooting video and stuff like that, it's definitely nice to be able to see it in live view because you're possibly moving around. You don't want to run into everything, so you kind of zone in when you go through the viewfinder. So what I like to do is choose my scene, kind of think of what I want the frame to look like in my eye with the sun and the light rays and the kelp or whatever. But then once I more or less have it framed up, it's going to be somewhere in there. Then I glue my face to the viewfinder and get in and start really tightly composing. And then every time you snap an image, it's going to flash across in the screen. And that's just such a joy compared to the alternative. I'm using this magnified viewfinder. Again, this makes it easy to see my composition, but all I'm really having to change is this cluster right here. There's 4 buttons. When I move this one up and down, or right and left, those 4 buttons are going to change my aperture, or they're going to change my shutter speed. For the most part, unless there's a surprise on a dive, that's all I ever do. Sometimes you think you're going to see something on a dive or shoot a certain way and you have to make a change on the fly. But for the most part, I knew what I wanted to do today. I wanted to shoot kelp fronds and light rays and things I haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah.
So all I need to do is make the small adjustments for that particular frame, which is going to be done for me generally with the aperture.
Okay, and so just to clarify, so when you're using those 4 buttons, are you pressing a button to activate the aperture and shutter speed and then using a dial to change it, or is it like the old Olympus menus where you actually had to use the arrow keys to change the aperture and shutter speed?
No, all we have to do once it's set. When you see your icons, you'll see the shutter speed and you'll see the aperture.
Yep.
When they have an arrow next to them as opposed to a wheel, that means you can change it. So really all you have to do is press right, left, or up or down.
Okay.
Now, if it falls out of that mode, this is one of the things we had to figure out before we went diving. If it falls out of that mode, push the top button. There's a cluster of 4. Push the top one, and those wheels will turn into arrows, and at that point you can change it. So yeah, it's just 4 buttons, back and forth, up, down, and right, left for aperture and shutter.
Okay, so it seems like OM system kind of stayed true to Olympus in that design when it came to changing the aperture and shutter speed, and that's pretty cool that they did that, kind of kept to their retro cameras. So if you are coming in from Olympus, it shouldn't feel too different at the same time. So.
Yeah, or the same thing with other cameras, even if you've been shooting Nikon and Canon too, because the alternative would be sometimes you have to reach around the housing to find a wheel and spin a wheel. It's nice that they're all right there. You can go right to them.
Yeah.
Those are really the only buttons you have to concern yourself. There is one other one though, obviously the preview button.
Right.
And then also in the top left on the back, there's a button that switches you from live view to the viewfinder itself.
Yeah.
So I guess you could argue that you have to memorize a button cluster for right, left, up, and down, and then 2 more. One for your preview and one to activate the electric viewfinder so you go back and forth from live view.
Yeah. And I think the fact that it has an electronic viewfinder to live view button is nice because most cameras don't actually have that, and then you have to set it in camera and it's kind of annoying. So as an underwater system, it's ideal to have that.
Yeah. The TTL for this, I'm always using TTL with a system like this. I found the TTL was dead on. I just pointed my strobes away. I had no issues with battery power. I wasn't shooting video, but I had no issues with battery power, battery life. Everything was very quick. The focus is fast. The recycle time was really fast. It was one of the smoothest new cameras that I've ever messed with. Usually there's a learning curve. I remember when I moved to the Sony A7R III after shooting Canons and Nikons for a year, it was a learning curve.
Yeah.
This was like, oh, okay, 4 buttons, I got it. I was ready to go in the water pretty quick.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess for our viewers, they should know that this camera shoots about 10 frames per second for burst shooting. Did you use the burst shooting function while you're diving?
No, I didn't have any fast action for that today. So no.
Okay, yeah, we didn't have too much. And then it also takes 20 megapixel photos, as well as 4K video at 60 frames per second, or at 120 frames per second. So
that's for slow-mo,
theoretically.
Yeah.
So now that we have the housing in our hands, I just kind of wanted to show people, this is the housing. So this camera itself is $2,200 for the body. It's similar to the Panasonic GH6 in a lot of ways. Olympus really stepped up their video game and they really want an equivalent to the GH6. It's not quite an equivalent, but it's a close second. What I think is really different for underwater videographers or photographers is the fact that at least with the Ikelite system, you have a much smaller housing with the Olympus. And so when you have the OM-1, it's actually a smaller system overall. And I'm assuming that was kind of nice.
Absolutely. When I saw the housing, when they told me about this camera, the flagship, I thought, well, if it's a flagship camera of Olympus, I'm sure I'll be happy with it. You know, it's new technology and everything else. When I saw the housing that it fit into, I was delighted, because this reminds me of my old friend, the SL1, 2, and 3, where it's just a really fast loading system. You can, excuse me, you can put a new film card, download, change your batteries, whatever. You can get in and out of this housing very, very quickly. And the 7-14 is, it is a type 2 lens, so you're going to have to put the housing on and then put the port on. But you wouldn't have to do that if you were shooting macro or some of the other lenses on this. This one just has kind of a wide flare at the end. So it is one more step compared to some of the smaller cameras. But boy, what a great housing to swim with. Pushing this through the water is a lot easier than our bigger housings, no question.
Yeah, so this is a dry lock micro housing. So you've got dry lock micro ports, and one of the cool things that I like about the DLM ports is that you actually have your zoom function on the port itself. So it's just kind of like a little bit more forward. It feels like it's almost like you're zooming a lens rather than just, you know, zooming a dial on the housing itself.
Yeah, it's a relatively short throw too. It's not a real long distance to spin this from 7 to 14 millimeters.
Oh, that's nice.
You can go back and forth pretty quick.
Okay. So how did you feel, you know, about the 7-14 behind that port? How was your corner sharpness, and did you feel like you needed a minimum? Like, what was your minimum aperture most of the time when you were shooting?
Yeah, well, most of the time when I'm in conditions like this, shooting wide angle, generally I'm using a stop down lens.
Right.
You know, these super wide lenses, they have great depth of field in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's pretty rare for me because I like to dive shallow. I like light rays. I like a lot of color. And in that situation with two strobes, I'm usually using a very stop down lens.
Yeah.
F8 certainly, lots of times, F14, F16, even F22 if I find like a little jellyfish or something like that. So in that stop, I didn't shoot anything with the lens wide open. I pretty much never use a super wide lens with the aperture wide open because usually I'm in pretty well lit conditions, I guess, when I dive.
Yeah. So F8 was probably the widest that
F8 would have been the widest that I shot today.
Okay.
And F18 would have been the most closed down I did. And I was leaving the shutter speed at about 160th.
Okay.
And I did my ISO at 200. There was plenty of light out there for that today.
Yeah. So you never bumped up the ISO or needed to?
Generally speaking, I know a lot of guys will poo-poo this or what. Generally speaking, when I go in the water, we don't have that much time. Things happen really quickly. I try to have one variable. Yeah. And for me, that variable is aperture. I like adjusting aperture because with super wide lenses, you can get away with it because of the incredible depth and field. I know a lot of guys like to bracket shutter speed over aperture, which is certainly an option. Yeah. But unless I'm trying to freeze light rays or freeze something that's moving pretty quick, I like to leave the shutter speed and the ISO alone, so I only have one thing to change. If I take an image and it's happening quickly and it's not right, it's just wrong, it's too dark, it's too light, I've only got one button to go to. I'm either going to open the lens up or I'm going to close the lens down. And that just means that you're not going to miss shots where you're going, okay, so where was the eye, where you're trying to find, especially with a camera that you're not real familiar with. I mean, use a camera like this for 4 or 5 years, you're going to know intuitively where everything is. Right. But like I said, I saw this last night, so I appreciate the fact that it was simple to get used to. Yeah.
And that's a really solid way to shoot. I have to say that I do exactly the same thing when it comes to Micro Four Thirds cameras. I think one of the cool things about having that smaller sensor and having more depth of field is that you can play with the aperture more, and then that leaves you with that one variable like you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I shot like that for years. I think that's a really good method when you're shooting Micro Four Thirds, even though it might not be, you might not be using the same method on a full frame. I shot like that too.
Yeah, when you're dealing with a lens, it's got a focal range of, and I was shot a lot at 7 millimeters today. Okay, the 7 millimeter lens, if there's a problem with your image, generally it's not going to be that it's out of focus because they're very fast, they focus quickly, and the depth of field is there. So if the image isn't any good, it's probably going to be because the composition is wrong, or it's too light or it's too dark.
Right.
It's almost impossible to take an image the way I was using it today. If we went through even all my worst images from today, they wouldn't be bad because they're soft focus. They'll all be pretty sharp focus. That's just one of the things you get when you deal with these focus lengths. It's one of the reasons I like shooting super wide anyway.
Yeah, definitely. Did you notice anything about the autofocus? You know, was it
fast?
It was fast.
All I can say is that it was fast, very, very, very fast, fast and almost silent. It was just almost there. The amount of time between when I put a little bit of pressure on the shutter until the flashes went off was pretty much instantaneous. The only thing I had a little trouble with, and this always happens to me when I have a new camera, is the half depressing it. Some shutters are a little more sensitive than the others, and this one was definitely light touch.
Okay.
So a lot of times I was trying to activate the meter or activate the viewfinder, and I'd actually pull the trigger. You see the flashes go off, which isn't necessarily a big deal because with a film card and shooting stills, you've got plenty of room to waste a few frames when you accidentally pulled the trigger.
Yeah. Can you set this camera up for back button autofocus?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I didn't do that today, but certainly you can set it up for back button. I know a lot of guys that work with models like back button focus.
Yeah, it just depends what you're doing.
Yeah.
With the smaller cameras, it's kind of nice to have just that, half press because it's it's just easy to reach.
Kind of an old school thing too.
Yeah, you just hold your hand out.
Yeah, a lot of us have been using half to press for a lot of years, so it's just a very familiar technique.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems just like a familiar camera, even though it definitely performs very well from the photos that I saw.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, like I said, new camera. It's the first 4/3 I've used from Olympus, and I'm looking forward to getting it back into the water tomorrow because it was problem free. Battery charged up and ready to get back in.
Stephen, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you about your experience, and it's been a pleasure diving with you for sure. I am excited to see this camera. It's kind of cool because I feel like it's the first in a line of cameras, and it's also the last in a line of cameras in a lot of ways. So it's a really, it's an inflection point in the market, and I think we're going to see a lot of happy customers, who want to go 4/3. This would be the camera to do it with.
Yeah, Olympus has always been, I'm looking forward to it too. Olympus has always been clever. They've done cool things, whether it's microscope on the microscope mode on the TG series or live composite and things like that. I mean, they do some pretty cool stuff, and I'm glad to see it in a camera that's not a point and shoot, and a camera that is it's like an old friend. I mean, this reminds me of many cameras that I've used over the years. Very friendly to use. I'm looking forward to getting it back in the water tomorrow.
Yeah, me too.